Chapter 8, Pacific Crossing. Please make sure you're following along in case you have any questions of the text as we go. After dinner, the family sat on the ingao, catching the evening wind and eating ice cream. Mrs. Ono fanned herself with a magazine. Her cheeks were flushed, her strands of hair out of place, and Mr. Ono, glasses on, read the newspaper, his empty bowl at his feet. He reported, "There was a fire in San Francisco, Lincoln-kun." Lincoln looked over his shoulder, scraping the bottom of his bowl with his spoon. "Where?" Mr. Ono pointed a thick finger at the story. "It says it was at an oil repository. Hunter's Point." Repository, Lincoln thought. What's that? "Do you know Hunter's Point?" asked Mr. Ono as he took off his glasses and wiped sweat from his brow. "I've never been there, but I know it's near Candlestick Park." Mr. Ono grunted and said, "San Francisco must be very, very big," and returned to reading his newspaper. Lincoln turned to Mrs. Ono. "Will you please cut my hair for Kempo?" She looked at his long and straggly hair and asked Mitsu in Japanese for the scissors. Mitsu scurried into the house and came out with a wooden box. "Dozo, please come," she said to Lincoln, rising. In the yard, the glow of the porch light, Lincoln sat with a dishcloth wrapped around his shoulders. "And you look different," Mitsu commented, eating a juicy peach. He licked his fingers and wiped his hands on his pants. "You'll look like me." He raked his hands over his shaved head. Mrs. Ono worked quickly, the cold scissors snaking around Lincoln's ears, and then she ran a clipper-like scissor over the top of his head. The hair piled onto the towel, and some strands drifted to the ground where the cat batted at them. Lincoln's long locks were gone, and in their place were bristles that tickled his palm. Lincoln rose from the chair and brushed the hair off his shoulders. "I'm not finished," Mrs. Ono said. She spoke to Mitsu in Japanese and then went inside. Lincoln's eyes grew big when Mitsu returned with a smooth, foot-long stick. "What's that?" It looked like some sort of doctor's tool and reminded Lincoln of every injection he had had at Kaiser Hospital. "A mimikaki, an ear pick." "It will not hurt," Mrs. Ono said, prodding him to the ingawa. She sat down and patted her lap. "Put your head here." "My head?" Lincoln felt embarrassed, and no one had ever cleaned his ears. He looked at Mitsu for help, but Mitsu was eating another peach and holding back a sticky smile. "It's painless," he said. "Easy." Lincoln narrowed his eyes in distrust. When he was 5, he had stuck a match inside of his ear, and the match snapped off. He didn't tell his mother for 3 days. And at that point, he had lost most of his hearing in the ear and went around yelling, "Huh? Huh?" whenever his mother spoke to him. Even the doctor had a difficult time getting the match out. "It feels good. I'll show you." Mitsu snuggled his head into his mother's lap and closed his eyes as she probed his right ear. Now and then she pulled out a clot of wax and wiped it onto the paper towel. After both ears were clean, Mitsu jumped to his feet. "See?" He cupped his hand around his ear and said, "I can hear better." Knowing that he had no choice, Lincoln laid his head on Mrs. Ono's lap. He winced as the ear pick probed into slow circles. But as Mitsu had said, it felt good. He actually almost fell asleep. Mrs. Ono laughed and wiped the mimikaki on the towel. "Lots of lumps," she said. Lincoln laughed to hide his embarrassment. He promised himself that he would clean his ears more carefully from that day on. That night at Kempo, he felt strong. Dressed in his gi, he stretched between 2 black belts on the lawn. He did 50 push-ups and 100 sit-ups, and he jumped to his feet, breathing hard. He ran his hand over his head. Smooth was his favorite feeling. They practiced throws during the intense workout, and Lincoln was tossed repeatedly, coming down each time like a cat. He had seen his sensei in San Francisco come down on both feet, his hands up and ready to fight. Now he was doing it. And he felt like he could take on the world, or at least his neighborhood back in San Francisco. Oyama Sensei had been studying Lincoln's technique from a distance. She stepped in between Lincoln and another brown belt, both of whom were breathing hard. Like this, she explained, gripping Lincoln's gi as she pivoted her hip into his. She pulled Lincoln off balance, tossed him into the air. He came down halfway across the yard on his knees with one hand in the pond and the other in the mud. He shook the mud off his hands and looking up said, "Wow." "Sorry, Lincoln-kun," Oyama Sensei said. "Are you okay?" Lincoln shrugged it off. Fine. That night, he hobbled home, a spark of pain in his back. The next day, after Lincoln and Mitsu had worked only a few hours in the field, Mitsu's mother said, "Go and have a drink." So she pressed some yen or money into their hands, and the boys hurried into town for a soda. In a far corner of the ice cream parlor, two old men sat under the overhead fan playing Go. So Go, side note, Go is like our version of checkers, but it also is kind of like chess because it is there's a lot of like thinking with it, like in terms of like processing and stuff like that. So I guess it's supposed to be a very popular game. So back to the text. Lincoln and Mitsu drank their sodas quickly, ordered seconds, and watched the men, neither of whom seemed to notice the boys. The men sat quietly and thoughtfully rubbed their whiskered chins as they considered the next strategy. Lincoln and Mitsu were wandering around town again when Mitsu said, "Let me show you something very interesting." He led Lincoln down a narrow alley filled with smoke. The ring of iron on iron sounded in the air, and flames could be seen flashing in a workshed. "My uncle is a master sword maker," Mitsu said, a hint of pride in his voice. Lincoln's curiosity grew as he peeked inside the shed and saw a young man turning the length of metal over an open fire. "Is that your uncle?" Lincoln asked. "No, that's an apprentice." Mitsu spoke to the young man in Japanese. The apprentice pointed to another room and returned to work. So if you go to the tech or do any type of like hands-on work, you are going to be an apprentice before you become, well, some like electricians, it's like journeyman and then master. So there's just different stages based on how much you know and what you're learning. So it's a little bit of information for you. Mitsu spoke to the young man in Japanese and he pointed to another room and returned to work. For a few minutes, Lincoln and Mitsu watched the apprentice roll the crude sword over the fire, then dip it into water mixed with ash. A gray cloud puffed up and drifted toward the darkened ceiling. The uncle appeared from the other room, tying his hair back with a hachamaki, a headband. His skin was dark, his arms splotched from burns, and his clothes were black with soot. His eyeglasses were flecked with ash. "Mitsu-kun, what brings you here?" he asked in Japanese. Mitsu bowed deeply to his uncle and introduced Lincoln, who bowed in turn and said, "Ohayo gozaimasu." Ohio. Well, the uncle greeted them. He apologized he didn't have anything for them to drink, but he offered them a stick of gum, and they accepted politely with bows of thanks, though each of them already had a pack of gum. "We were just passing," Mitsu said. "Lincoln is staying with us for the summer. He's from California." "Ah, so California," he beamed, turning to Lincoln. Mitsu translated for his uncle, who said that his best customers came from California. Lincoln smiled but didn't say anything. He was in awe of the master swordsmith. He was in awe of Japan. He had already met two honest-to-goodness masters, first in Kempo and now in sword making. Mitsu's uncle talked, hands pressed together, and Mitsu translated. Uncle asks if there are millionaires on every street in California. That's what he hears. Not my street, Lincoln replied. He thought of his old neighborhood in the Mission District, where junky cars often sat on blocks and litter scuttled freely when the wind picked up. If there were a millionaire, it would probably be the liquor store owner, who did a brisk business at 5 when the workers got off from the warehouse near Valencia Street. Lincoln and Mitsu stayed a while. They watched the length of metal as it was heated over the fire. The apprentice rolled it through the flames, pounded it over an anvil, and heated it again until it glowed neon orange. It's bad, Lincoln said in praise. Yes, very, very bad, Mitsu repeated. From the sword foundry, Lincoln and Mitsu returned home. While they played catch in the yard, Mitsu lamented, the fact that he hadn't made the summer baseball league. That's a drag, Lincoln said as he picked up an easy grounder and sidearmed it to Mitsu. A drag? Mitsu asked. What do you mean? Lincoln explained, and after much thought, Mitsu remarked, very American. Americans talk in slang. There's Mexican slang, black slang, Asian slang, yuppie slang. Mitsu sighed and said, I'll never learn English. It's too difficult. You will. When you come see me in San Francisco, you'll be rattling your lips like the rest of us. When it was close to 4, Lincoln told Mitsu that he had to go meet Tony. I'll come, Mitsu said, tossing his glove onto the porch and scaring the cat. No, Lincoln said. He and Tony were going to plan the party for their host families, and it had to be a surprise. Awkward moment. Mitsu looked hurt. Lincoln tried to explain that they were meeting to plan something special. It's a surprise. You'll see. A surprise? Yes, a surprise. Don't get lost, Mitsu said as he walked Lincoln to the gate. He pointed down the street and told him 3 times to take a left and go right at the first signal. Lincoln turned around when he was halfway down the street and saw Mitsu at the gate, pointing right. That Vado is all right, Lincoln said to himself. He felt bad leaving Mitsu at home. I should have invited him, he told himself. As punishment, he punched a wall and hurt his hand. Lincoln found Tony already undressed. An old man was scrubbing his back, muttering something in Japanese. Hey, Link, Tony greeted him. Who's the guy? Lincoln asked. I don't know. He just started scrubbing my back. Lincoln undressed as he watched Tony trade places and then scrubbed the man's back. The man scolded in Japanese, and although neither Lincoln nor Tony could understand the words, both of them knew that the man wanted to be scrubbed harder. Lincoln grabbed a washcloth and helped Tony rub the man's back. When they finished, the man stood up, bowed, and got into the pool, sighing loudly. Lincoln and Tony planned the party as they sat in the tub. How about Friday? Tony asked. Sounds good. Do you know how to make tortillas? No, I thought you did. Well, not really. But I've watched my mom a million times. Lincoln fanned his face. Man, you could kill someone with this water. Tell you what, Link. I brought the beans. Why don't I give them to you and let you cook them? You brought the beans? Yeah. Tony pointed to his backpack, which was in the wicker basket. Fair enough. If you make the tortillas. Lincoln rose from the water and toweled off. See if you can find some avocados. I'll look for chilies and tomatoes and make some salsa. Let's meet here again tomorrow. They dressed and started home, stopping to drink Cokes and thumb through comic books at the newsstand. Lincoln said, Let me try some Japanese on you. He thought deeply and then said, Anata no tanjubi wa itsu desu ka? What'd you say? Tony asked. I think, what day is your birthday? Or what is your favorite color? I forget which. Mitsu was trying to teach me. Today is my birthday, Tony cracked. And money is my favorite color. ¿Entiendes? Lincoln punched his friend in the arm and headed home.